Hi everyone, welcome to Geetham University of Bangalore. So we have with us Professor Dilip Menon as part of the international conference that we are organizing here, Modernities Redefined Perspectives from South Asia. And Professor Dilip Menon needs no introduction in a sense, but for the benefit of the audience, so Professor Dilip Menon works at University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. And Professor Dilip Menon was educated at Delhi, Oxford and Cambridge. And his recent work has been focused on oceanic histories and the questions of epistemologists from the global south and how do we think about theories from the global south, from a very located position. And thanks for the wonderful keynote lecture and all the discussion we have been having over here. And so today we'll be having a very brief conversation about the larger theme that the conference is discussing, which is a very much debated topic in social sciences ever since, which is the idea of modernity.
Right.
And since your work has largely focused on the epistemologies from the global south of late, and the need to move beyond the temporalities coming from the modern West, as you talked today morning.
Right.
So in that, what I would like to hear from you is that how is this oceanic history, or because we have this whole conversation about Indian Ocean studies and oceanic histories. So how do you see that as a way forward to move beyond these Western temporalities?
Actually, at a very broad level, when one thinks about the first movement of human beings, the first anatomically modern human beings 40,000 years ago from Africa, making their way north all the way through to Polynesia, we're thinking about a kind of movement that is prior to the notion of borders or indeed of difficulty, because they cross mountains, cross the ocean and land up in Polynesia. And what we have subsequently is a slow closing in of the world as we have the appearance of these entities, continental entities, ideas of Asia, ideas of Europe, Africa and so on, and the Americas are late to be discovered as continents. And then there's a process of opening up again, when you have the age of discovery, as it's called, when Europe realizes its own ignorance of the world and then travels to other parts of the world like Vasco da Gama, Magellan prior to him, and which then is followed by colonialism and the subjugation of territories through violence, the extermination of indigenous peoples, and then the rise of nationalism and a further closing where you have these territorial entities that emerge, which are built on notions of the state, citizenship and territory primarily. So when we think about history writing and imaginations from this movement, we are really thinking from the standpoint of these very narrow national imaginations and the kind of pressures that it puts on the free flow of people. Right? So alongside the nation state, we also have the always ongoing histories of movement, whether it's the boat people from Cambodia, whether it's the Rohingyas contemporarily, whether it's the Syrians, or indeed the Sri Lankan Tamils, making their way during the 1980s all the way along the Mediterranean into Canada and so on. So what studying oceanic history reminds us is that there is this impulse which is born out of the spirit of adventure, which is born out of the spirit of wanting to engage with a much wider world than the space that one occupies. So it's important also to remember that people's minds occupy much larger territories than their bodies inhabit. So when we think about the oceanic imagination, we're thinking about people constantly on the move, either pushed as a result of state violence, civil wars and so on, or people making their way out in order to seek their fortune. So if you think about the early 20th century, you had Indians after the collapse of the Swadeshi movement and colonial repression. Indian revolutionaries are making their way eastwards into Japan and all the way through to California and Canada, westwards into Germany. After all, M.N. Roy moves and founds the Communist Party of Mexico, which is an act of temerity that only Bengalis are capable of. Right? So the oceanic history reminds us that the world has always been much larger, and the English phrase, the world is my oyster, that people have constantly rebelled against governmentality and its impositions, and people have always seen the ocean as a zone of escape. That's one thing. The second thing to think about is that when the kind of hubris that creates the partition of Indian Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, these are our creation because the waters are continuous. The whales don't really bother which ocean they're floating through. And what has happened of late is really also our realization that when we think about continuous oceans, we think about a history that is beyond the history of the nation state again. So for example, with the Spanish conquest of Mexico, the silver that comes out of there and moves back to Spain creates a price revolution in Europe. But that same silver is moving across the ocean the other way via Philippines into China. So I think what it allows us to do, I mean, this is just giving you a lot of examples, but doing oceanic history allows us to see how territories are created through the adventurous imaginings of people. It allows us to see that the nation state is a very recent and probably transient phenomenon, and nation states have never been able to police the ocean. And thirdly, I think it reminds us yet again of something that we forget, that 90% of the world's trade is carried on through the ocean, as we saw when the ship got stuck in the Suez Canal and that held up, and now with the Houthis trying to stop trade near Djibouti in protest against the Israeli occupation of Palestine and so on and so forth. So I think there are multiple histories that one could think about which are beyond the narrow imaginings of the nation.
So building from that, so in a way you're stressing the importance not only to move beyond the real territorial sort of entities, but also the mental mappings of the same.
Yes.
And in doing that, I see the intellectual move and the need to do that in many different ways. My question is, in the current political predicament that India is going through, this whole link between nationalism and history writing has become ever more complicated and political, very overtly political in nature. So in that context, how do you think about how do you see the future of history writing in India in this way, given our current political predicament?
Right. See, because I think we've arrived at a certain kind of impasse. It's a kind of blockage we've arrived at with regard to the writing of history, which is so intimately connected to the history of the nation state. At one point in our history, contemporary history, world history, call it what you will, the nation state had emerged as an emancipatory phenomenon, right? And so when we talk about decolonization, decoloniality, the bitter wars that were fought so that people could be free, and that initial impulse of nationalism, once it turns inwards and it creates spaces, it creates incarcerative spaces, it creates prisons. So when you think about the geography of India, for example, as it's taught, it's the Kashmir to Kanyakumari, the seven sister states as they're so sentimentally referred to Gujarat. And you think there's much more to this in terms of the movement of people, the movement of material, the movement of religion, the movement of ideology. So we've reached a dead end which allows only a looking inwards rather than an outwards. What I mean by that is that looking inwards is not only spatial, but it's also temporal. Right? So in the search for a new modern India, we look back to an ancient past that is uncluttered by strife. It's imagined that everything was equal, it's imagined that there were great scientific achievement, and so on and so forth. What history needs to do now is to start looking outwards to the ocean, which connects up with the first point. But to move to another point, I think moving outwards from the nation state also reminds us of the prisoners of the nation state. Right? So during the early 20th century, when Kerala was a madhouse, as Vivekananda described it, at that very point there were large numbers of untouchables making their way across the ocean. And this is true for all of India, right? From untouchables from Punjab. The first movement of untouchables, the Adharm movement, is founded by Swami Achyutananda, who makes his way across the ocean via Southeast Asia, becomes a laborer in California, and then returns to India with that experience of travel and mobility to found the Adhar movement. So what we need to think about is that within this incarcerated space of the nation, there have been these multiple imaginations of people who have been always subordinated, whether it's Dalits, whether it's Muslims, and you can multiply the example. There have been female travelers. The Begum of Bhopal was a very famous traveler. So one way of releasing this blockage is to ask if, as Partha Chatterjee put it in his the phrase, "a nation and its outcasts." So if we are to think the nation and history through the outcasts, then suddenly we are forced to move beyond the space of the nation, because beyond the nation resides a space of freedom, resides a space of an untraveled imagination.
Yeah, so definitely that imagining the nation has become a very political and a vexed question,
Right.
particularly in the current times that we are in. And I'll now ask my colleague Shashi Kumar to take it forward some of his questions.
Okay, I will start by continuing the discussion we just had. So these attempts by the Indian nation state now to kind of limit history writing and to encroach to the academic world has been sometimes couched in the language of decolonizing, that there are different blog articles, WhatsApp forwards, etc., which portray these attempts to intervene in academia as decolonizing the Indian mind from the Eurocentric mode of thinking. And you also have the experience of closely witnessing or even experiencing or even leading the movement in African universities, which ask for some kind of decolonized sphere of knowledge production. So how do you compare these experiences of decolonizing movement in Africa, which sort of put forward some emancipatory potential, and the attempts in India of the right-wing forces to appropriate this language of decolonization to replace the present academic atmosphere with a more Brahminical and socially conservative atmosphere?
An interesting question. It's a huge question, and I'll try and give you a short answer if possible. Because it's not without significance that ideas of decoloniality emerged from Latin America. Because while Latin America was a space where the First Nation states emerged, Latin America has always lived under the shadow of American imperialism, right? Through the Monroe Doctrine, which preserved South America as the sphere, as America's backyard. So all through the 20th century, starting from the 1953, the coup in Guatemala and so on, and to continuing interference, the interference in Chile. So there is a way in which Latin American thinkers were constantly engaged with the idea of continuing colonialism and the need for decoloniality, the idea that then subsequently got aligned with Marxism, the idea of delinking from a global political economy and so on. In Africa, in South Africa, not speaking for the 54 countries of Africa, but in South Africa, we had the end of apartheid in the early 1990s. But what happened as with India and in most other decolonized nations is that we continued with an inherited pedagogy. Right? An inherited pedagogy had Europe at its center, had certain categories that were central to European history, like the French Revolution, Enlightenment, Renaissance, and so on. And these were seen as exemplars. The rest of the world could merely repeat this history if it could, which is why in India we were obsessed with questions of why don't we have revolution, why don't we have capitalism, and so on. Instead of asking the proper question is what do we have and how do we study it? So in South Africa, the movement for decolonizing education arose with the fact that a new generation in an independent post-apartheid nation felt that they were weighed down by the baggage, the nightmares of the past, and an inherited pedagogy that did not allow them to move forward. So they said, you need to change your syllabus. They brought down the symbols of an early colonial order, as you know, bringing down the statue of Cecil Rhodes and so on. And all of these went together. And the demand that they made of the university is that we need to think about the fact that we are an African university and ask ourselves a simple question. How is an African university different from a European or an American university? That simple question yields very complex answers. So you have to then ask yourself, how do you ponder on this question without retreating into a nativism? Right? Something that is uniquely African, that is, when you celebrate that, which leads us to the question of India. Indeed, in India, the engagement with decolonization has been a celebratory nativism. Right? The idea that somehow India has possessed, does possess, and will possess all knowledge that there is. We don't need to look elsewhere. But the fundamental irony in all of this is that when you go back to the 18th century and you look at the enterprise of the early Orientalists like William Jones, Colebrooke, all of them, who were recovering old Hindu past, because here was Europe coming out, as it were, and suddenly discovering civilizations that were far older, far richer. And so you have the Orientalists actually engaging with this. So Shakuntala makes its way in translation, arrives in Germany. Goethe is suddenly seized of the idea of world literature at that point, and so on. But it's important to remember that this particular Orientalism was also constructed as against an immediate Islamic Mughal past.
Yes.
Right? And this is the inheritance of Hindu nationalism. Hindu nationalism worships the products of colonialism, ironically enough. They look to William Jones and all these approbation, the praise that is showered in Indian civilization by former colonizers, and accepts it and makes it their own. And at the same time also inherits the anti-Islamic. Right? So it's a very, very curious, unreflective nativism that is at the heart of the current decolonization project. So when people say, you talk about decolonization, but look what's happening in India, I think this is a misplaced question which doesn't really understand the historical process in operation. Very often the easy response to this is that you say you're a Marxist, do you approve of Stalin? So I think we need a much more complex, nuanced and textured understanding of decolonization and the impulse to free the imagination from the nightmares of the past.
I think our discussion regarding decolonizing attempts in African universities, or at least South African universities, as you said, would be incomplete without the reference to increasingly problematize Gandhi, because one of the developments that have been observed, especially from an Indian point of view, is that Gandhi is being increasingly identified with another kind of dominating tendency. And even when earlier figures like Nelson Mandela had been appreciative of Gandhi's anti-racist activities, now we are seeing intellectuals coming from campuses who are more critical of Gandhi, and even very overt acts like demolishing Gandhi statues and all. So as an Indian who went to South Africa and works in the South African academia or South African university space, how do you see these developments of problematizing Gandhi?
See, I think very often Gandhi is understood as a political philosopher and Ambedkar is seen as a politician, right? And now our understanding of that is flipped. Ambedkar never won an election in his life. He was a failure as a politician. He had to be nominated to the Constituent Assembly. Whereas Gandhi, if you think about him, was an arch political strategist, right? And so in my opinion, if we have to study Gandhi, we must study him as a political strategist rather than as a political philosopher. As a political philosopher, he was extremely hierarchical, extremely conservative, believed in making haste slowly, as the phrase goes. So we are contending with a figure who is really of the 19th century. This is important to remember. He was born in 1869. Right? And he came from a patrician family. Right? Very often, again, in the Marxist dismissals of Gandhi, people call him a Bania. But it's important to remember that the place of the merchant in Gujarat and in Rajasthan is very different. He came from a family of advisors to kings. So there is a hierarchical conservative notion that he preserves throughout his life, which allows him to think with the idea of the Varnashrama as an ideal order.
Yes.
His relationship to Dalits remains very, very ambiguous till the very end of his life. When he comes to South Africa, he's very concerned. Hind Swaraj, which is often touted as this text which is a discussion, a critique of modernity and industrial civilization, Hind Swaraj is actually written in response to the fact that Indians in South Africa are being treated on par with the Africans. If you read Hind Swaraj very carefully, or indeed not very carefully, you reread it right now, you will see that he posits an idea of Indian civilization as against the uncivilized African. He explicitly states that we're being reduced to the status of Negroes. Right? And so this is a profound dilemma only if you see him study Gandhi backwards, right? But if you study Gandhi forwards from his development as a conservative aristocrat even, he trumps even Nehru. Nehru is just a jumped up lawyer, right? So when you think about that, then this question of Gandhi's conservatism, his attitudes to race, his attitudes to caste, also allow us to see that there is very little political mileage. There is no political emancipatory program that you can build with Gandhi. What he allows us to understand is a certain kind of strategic way of negotiating with empire. His programs of civil disobedience, his fasting and so on. But in terms of his thought, he's very conservative, which is what has led to the destruction of his statues and the opposition of a generation that feels that, look, we need to think about an emancipation that exceeds this kind of conservative holding back. Whereas Ambedkar asked for a more radical kind of engagement with the idea of human equality. In fact, he writes equality on every page of the Constitution. It's another fact that he's denied it. But so you see, I think there is a history that we have to engage with where we need to rethink many of our categories. Right? And when people say South Africa was the making of Gandhi, it's both true and not true. It's true in the sense that he learns to work with Muslims and others. He gets a sense of himself as an Indian rather than as a Gujarati. This is what David Hardiman has argued. But on the other hand, there is also a way in which he sees the imperial state as something that he has to work with, right? And also to keep the lid on social revolution, right? Which he does consistently, as we know.
One effect of a right-wing upsurge that is happening in India or maybe globally is that we are now less focused on how the left political praxis take place. And you are a historian or a sociologist who has depicted that how communism in Kerala was not just an implant of a foreign ideology, but it was sort of creatively reinterpreted as mainly as an ideology of caste equality,
right,
to cite your argument. So I would like to ask you how you see the contemporary left praxis in Kerala, especially when this increasing critique is being placed that the left has been historically a failure in addressing non-class categories, especially caste-based exclusions.
Right, and I suppose it's a very important question, because I think the reason why, as people from Kerala, I mean, apart from the fact that we are citizens of India and of a larger space, as people from Kerala, we have this deep ambivalence towards Marxism, unless you're a member of the party, is that you constantly come up against the limits of a certain form of historical imagination and political practice. So, but whereas as an undergraduate, I was deeply influenced by Marxism because that was a default option in the 1980s. As I began to, once I finished when I was writing my PhD, I came to understand that caste posed a problem for the Communist Party, even as they presented themselves as a party working towards caste egalitarianism. They were very reluctant to allow Dalits to ascend to leadership posts. And EMS Namboodiripad very clearly says that the party need not be a window shop that advertises the multiple castes. This is the place of hierarchy in Kerala. So this question continues into the present. And so when we talk about the famous Kerala model, any amount of literature has pointed out the number of outliers, the fisher people, the Dalits, the Adivasis. And here the idea was that the question of class would trump every other identity. Right? Just as much as when you think about Indian nationalism, the idea is that the idea of Indian citizenship trumps every other identity, and that anybody who doesn't accord with this is regarded as a traitor, and so on and so forth. So in Kerala, this question of the non-addressing of the issue of caste, non-addressing of the issue of the Adivasi, is a fundamental problem. And this is indeed where, or in some sense, the non-engagement with the question of religion. Right? So this is what has resulted in the present crisis, where you find large sections of society which are alienated from the party, the Dalit movement. Why was the Dalit literary movement so late to emerge in Kerala? In Maharashtra it emerges in the 70s, Tamil Nadu it emerges. Here there was this kind of imaginative suppression that happened. And right now we are faced with the fact that we are the state with the most number of RSS shakas in India, more than 5,000, right? Much more than UP, which is the strong one. How do we think with this? What has allowed this to happen? One way in which the Communist Party deals with it is political violence in Kannur. As you know, 200 deaths over the last 30 years, 4,000 people injured and so on. But in the rest of Kerala, there is this issue that the party has not found an effective way to counter an increasing Hinduization of society through its setting aside of the problem, right? Because it constitutes itself through governance, it constitutes itself through issues of class relations, which are both good and bad. But it doesn't work with the grain of an emerging society. It works with an understanding of an ideal future society. And the present is a very problematic one. And this has been exacerbated by the movement to the Gulf, for example. Large numbers of Muslims are going and working and coming back wealthy. Large numbers of Hindus are going and experiencing what it is to be a minority in a Muslim-ruled state, so they come back with deep resentments. So my fear is that what will happen in Kerala will be a sudden sea change. It's not going to be gradual. It's like what happened in West Bengal, where 30 years the party was in power and then it was gone. Right? And a similar thing could happen in Kerala if the party does not wake up, so to speak. Because if the Gulf, engagement with the Gulf ends, everybody comes back, there's going to be a tip.
Yeah. And connected to that, and we'll come to the last question for tonight's conversation. So, in some ways, we're hinting at the failure of the left to have a kind of a certain critical engagement with this domain of culture in the way it should have.
Right.
So, and even when we take this larger theme for this conference, modernities redefined. So, in thinking about modernity, of course, this concept of culture has emerged as a major vantage point from where you critically engage with modernities, like if you take multiple modernities or the ideas of alternative modernities, global modernities, there are many adjectives attached to it now. But do you think that this attempt to redefine modernity have also been caught up in this domain of culture, and we do not pay adequate attention to the questions of political economy or other very relevant pressing questions? So in that way, how do we take this conversation forward about redefining modernity beyond culture and seeing communities as cultural groups, etc.?
Yes, I think that's a very important point that you've raised, because one of the consequences of our being slaves of the theoretical movements that emerge from elsewhere, whether it's that of deconstruction, post-colonial theory, and so on and so forth, is that these are movements that have happened within the academy, right? They have no connection with the larger politics. Whereas if you go back to an earlier period in left politics, to give you a very, very simple example, I mean, there's something that we all know. Why is it that Kerala has not produced academic intellectuals? What we have produced are writers, poets, political activists. Bengal has produced a huge intellectual establishment, and that also reflects the different histories of Bengal and Kerala. Ours has been a very democratic movement. None of our leaders even went to college, right? Whether it's AKG or EMS, whereas they London Return, Bharat Law, Inner Temple, and so they created a particular investment in cultural capital alongside the history of the university, colonial university in Bengal. So in Kerala, we did have that moment when political economy mattered, political participation mattered, mobilization mattered, which is why we were able to take the ideas of someone like Narayana Guru and make it an everyday phenomenon, right? Where we aspire to equality. And now we are in a situation again where, apart from the other things that we discussed, our intellectual establishment, as it is growing, is retreating more and more into culture without an engagement with political economy. And the party itself is got into a groove, as we discussed earlier. So this is bound to have very dramatic consequences. And I think any kind of engagement with the idea of culture has to be allied with an idea of a political involvement and an understanding of a global political economy, and which is what Marxism in an earlier moment allowed us to do, right? And indeed, I think it's too short a time to be talking about all of this, but I think you've touched upon something that is very important. How do we become, as the phrase goes, intellectuals engagés? How do we become intellectuals who are also invested in the world and changing the world? And that's probably the way forward that we need to think about. And thinking with the subaltern certainly helps, as I spoke about in my lecture.
I think that's a very good note to have to end this conversation for the time being on modernities, redefining this whole project of modernities, and how do we think with the subalterns, with the kind of imaginations it comes up with, which often goes beyond the mental mappings of the nation state, and the ideas of history writing, and how do we think about the oceans. So we'll end with that note, and we thank Professor Dilip Menon for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you for those excellent questions.
So, and we thank you for accepting our invitation and coming to Dilip University of Bangalore, and for spending time with us and sharing your valuable insights. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.